Hello, it's Joe from 10 Minute Murder, and I've got something exciting to share with you. If you enjoy 10 Minute Murder, you enjoy this podcast, you are really going to love my new one, 10 Minute Mystery. Here's the deal. 10 Minute Mystery, it takes the brief and bingeable format, that same vibe you already know from this podcast, but instead of just true crime cases, we dive headfirst into history's most puzzling mysteries. We're talking unsolved cases, conspiracy theories, strange disappearances, aliens. Of course, you can't have a mystery podcast without talking about aliens. It's all the stories that make you just question everything. Stories that make you lean in and say, WTF. So for this episode, the one that I've got here, we're unraveling one of the most infamous cases in American history, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. It's a story of fame, tragedy, and some seriously unsettling questions about what really went down that cold night in March 1932. So if you enjoy 10 Minute Mystery, please subscribe and share the podcast. Thanks. It's March 1932, and the Lindbergh estate in New Jersey sits quiet and still. Inside, Charles Lindbergh, the golden boy of aviation, and his wife, Anne, tuck their 20-month-old son, Charles Jr., into bed. Seems like the perfect family, right? By morning, the illusion is shattered. The crib is empty. A ransom note demands $50,000. Chaos erupts. A ransom paid, a body found, and Bruno Richard Hauptmann executed for the crime. But here's the twist. What if the darkest truths about this case weren't about a kidnapper sneaking in? What if they were already inside the house? Today we dig into the Lindbergh baby case and the shadowy legacy of Charles Lindbergh, perfection, obsession, and the chilling theories that still haunt this story. Charles Lindbergh was the embodiment of the American dream, a humble Midwestern boy who rose to international fame as the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic. The press adored him. Men envied him. Women wanted to marry him, and when he did marry Anne Morrow, the daughter of a diplomat, their union seemed plucked from the pages of a fairy tale. Then came the baby, Charles Jr. He was America's sweetheart, with curly blonde hair and cherubic cheeks. But behind the scenes, whispers circulated. The baby wasn't as robust as it seemed. Sources suggest Charles Jr. might have shown early signs of rickets, a condition caused by vitamin D deficiency. Symptoms included bowed legs, a soft skull, and developmental delays. In an era obsessed with physical health, these traits stood out, especially to Charles Lindbergh, who had very specific ideas about strength. Lindbergh wasn't just a hero. He was obsessed with the concept of human perfection. He nicknamed his son It, a cruel jab that made some people squirm when it slipped into conversation. He reportedly played twisted pranks, like hiding the baby in a closet to test Anne's reaction. This wasn't a family untouched by tragedy. It was a family teetering on the edge of something much, much darker. March 1st, 1932. The Lindbergh house was eerily quiet that night. Charles Jr. was put to bed at 7:30 p.m. Hours later, a nurse discovered the crib empty. A single ransom note demanded $50,000, a fortune in the throes of the Great Depression. But here's where it gets strange. The supposed kidnappers used a homemade ladder to access the nursery on the second floor. The ladder was unstable, poorly constructed, and yet somehow they avoided detection. The dogs did not bark. The Lindbergh estate was small. How did someone navigate in total darkness without tripping alarms, waking anyone, or causing the dogs to bark? The ransom note seemed clumsy, written in broken English, and yet the kidnappers knew exactly where to find the baby. Too many of the details didn't add up. Weeks later, the baby's body was found. It was discovered less than 5 miles from the Lindbergh home. The remains were badly decomposed, and the official report cited trauma as the cause of death. Missing organs were attributed to scavengers, but whispers of something far darker seemed to circulate. Could this have been a carefully staged crime? And if so, who stood the most to gain? To understand the suspicions surrounding Charles Lindbergh, we need to dive into his beliefs, specifically his fascination with eugenics. Eugenics was a pseudoscience that sought to improve the human race through selective breeding. In the 1930s, it wasn't fringe, it was disturbingly mainstream. Lindbergh wasn't just a casual supporter of eugenics, he was deeply invested. He later wrote essays endorsing sterilization of those who he deemed unfit, and expressed admiration for Nazi Germany's racial policies. Now, consider this. Lindbergh's firstborn son, the heir to his legacy, might have had health issues that clashed with Lindbergh's obsession with strength and perfection. Imagine the frustration, the shame of seeing your vision for a perfect family marred by what you perceive as genetic weakness. There's a theory, controversial and chilling, that Lindbergh orchestrated the kidnapping as a way to erase what he saw as a flaw in his legacy. Some have even suggested that he staged a mercy killing, believing it was kinder to end the child's life than to let him grow up as an imperfect heir. Is there evidence to prove this? Not directly. But Lindbergh's cold demeanor and obsession with control cast a long shadow over the investigation. In 1934, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a German immigrant and carpenter, was arrested for the crime. The evidence seemed damning. Marked ransom money found in his possession and wood from the latter matched his workshop. But Hauptmann denied everything, insisting he was innocent until his execution in 1936. And here's the thing, the case against Hauptmann wasn't airtight. Key pieces of evidence have been criticized as circumstantial. Witness testimonies were shaky at best. And yet, the media and the public were desperate for closure. Hauptmann became the perfect scapegoat. What if the real mastermind was never investigated? Could Lindbergh's towering reputation have shielded him from scrutiny? After all, no one wanted to believe that America's hero could be capable of something so monstrous. So where does all of this leave us? The trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann brought some closure, at least, officially. The man was convicted and executed, and the Lindbergh family moved on, or so it seemed. But here's the thing, the deeper you dig, the more cracks in this case start to show. And those cracks, they leave behind questions that have haunted this story for nearly a century. Let's start with the shadow that followed Charles Lindbergh himself. After the trial, Lindbergh didn't just fade into quiet family life. No, he took a turn, a very public turn, and very disturbing turn. He became an outspoken advocate for eugenics, that pseudoscientific movement obsessed with the idea of perfecting the human race through selective breeding. Lindbergh wasn't shy about his beliefs either. He wrote about the need to protect the gene pool, supported sterilization for those deemed unfit, and even admired Nazi Germany's racial policies. Let that sink in for a second. That wasn't just some passing interest. He was deeply invested in these ideas. And it makes you wonder, was this obsession already taking root back in 1932? Did it shape the way he viewed his own son? Because here's the tough part to talk about. Charles Jr. was reportedly not the perfect, healthy child the public believed him to be. There were whispers, signs that he probably had rickets. For someone like Lindbergh, who seemed fixated on strength and perfection, that might have been more than just a disappointment. You think about the way Lindbergh treated his son, calling him it, playing cruel pranks. That's not normal fatherly behavior. It paints a picture of a man who was cold, detached, and maybe even resentful of a child he thought to be a failure in his genetic legacy. But does all that, including Lindbergh's cold obsession with eugenics, drive him to stage a kidnapping? Some believe that he viewed the baby's health as a flaw so serious that he needed to be erased permanently. It sounds crazy, but when you consider Lindbergh's later actions, his cold demeanor during the investigation, and the gaps in the case against Hauptmann, it's not hard to wonder, could America's hero have been the architect of its greatest tragedy? And speaking of Hauptmann, let's talk about him for a second. The evidence that sent him to the electric chair has been debated for decades. Sure, the marked ransom money was found in his possession, the wood from the latter matched his workshop, but those details, while incriminating, very incriminating, don't paint a full picture. How and why would a man with no prior connection to the Lindberghs pull off a crime this precise and leave behind such obvious evidence? And more importantly, why did Hauptmann maintain his innocence right up until his execution? He never confessed, not even to save his own life. It raises the question, was he just a convenient scapegoat? Because here's the thing, Lindbergh was untouchable. He wasn't just a celebrity, he was an icon. His reputation was a fortress, and no one, especially in the 1930s, was going to question him too hard. Even after the trial, lingering suspicions about an inside job persisted. The family's dogs didn't bark that night. The kidnappers seemed to know exactly where to go in the Lindbergh estate. And let's not forget the ladder. So unstable, it seemed like a rickety death trap. It doesn't take much to wonder if this kidnapping was something else entirely. So what's the legacy of the Lindbergh baby case? On the surface, it's a story about kidnapping gone wrong, a grieving family, and a manhunt that gripped the nation. But dig deeper, and it becomes something far more unsettling. It's about the lengths some people will go to protect their image. It's about how the obsession with perfection can lead to unthinkable choices. And it's about a man, Charles Lindbergh, who was both a hero and a deeply flawed human being, capable of inspiring millions while harboring belief that, quite frankly, make your skin crawl. In the end, the Lindbergh baby's tragic fate leaves us with more questions than answers. Was this a simple kidnapping, a crime of opportunity, or something much darker? We're never going to know the truth, but one thing is certain. The story of Charles Lindbergh Jr. isn't just what happened that night. It's about what it reveals, the shadows that linger even in the brightest lives and the mysteries that refuse to let go. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of 10 Minute Mystery. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review. It helps more curious minds discover the show. And if you're hungry for more stories like this, maybe a little creepier, check out my other podcast, 10 Minute Murder, where I dive into true crime stories that are brief, bingeable, but more murdery. See you next time.